Good evening and welcome to the Week in Review. I'm Paris Schutz. We'll be joined by our Week in Review guests in just a moment, but first, some of today's top stories. Whole Foods announces it's closing its store in Englewood on the city's south side. The announcement comes as the high-end grocery chain plans to close 5 other stores around the nation, including the store inside DePaul in Lincoln Park. The Englewood closure is a bitter blow for the community, only 6 years after opening with great fanfare in what was then a food desert. It was funded in part with more than $10 million in city tax increment financing. The company announces that employees at the store will be eligible for jobs at other stores. Mayor Lightfoot expressed disappointment but says she'll work with the community to repurpose that storefront. The tax bill is reportedly going to jump at Trump Tower, Chicago. The Chicago Sun-Times reports that the Cook County Assessor's Office slapped a 68% increase over last year on assessments for that building. Assessor Fritz Quigley says the value of the retail space at the tower has gone up, even though that space sits largely vacant. Quigley is facing a heated re-election battle for the office against Metropolitan Water Reclamation Board President Carrie Steele. With the 39th pick in the NFL draft, the Chicago Bears select Kyler Gordon, a cornerback from Washington. The Bears sat out the first round of the draft this year due to last year's draft where the team traded up to select quarterback Justin Fields. The Bears have another round of draft picks tonight in what is new general manager Ryan Poles' first crack at the event. We'll have more on this new pick later in the program. And now to our Week in Review panel. Joining us are Mike Mulligan of WSCR-AM 670 The Score, our very own Heather Sharon, Becky Vivi of WBEZ, and Jacqueline Serrato with Southside Weekly. So let's get right into it. Becky Vivi, the Sun-Times reports that Mayor Lightfoot has tipped her hand and she is going to run for re-election. Meanwhile, Congressman Mike Quigley, who is testing the waters, decides he will not. First of all, why is he not going to get in the race?
Well, it sounds like he is doing it for some personal reasons. He was kind of citing his age and his family and just how hard it is to be the mayor of Chicago, and that this is not something he wants to do at this time. I imagine, I haven't sensed bad blood between him and Mayor Lightfoot, so I imagine there may have been, who knows, a conversation between the two, and maybe he just decided that challenging her was not in the cards.
And Heather Sharon, what's behind Mayor Lightfoot really stretching this decision out? We mentioned last week she kind of teased the decision at a City Club speech, and she kind of keeps teasing it here.
Yeah, it's clear that part of what's happening here is that she is perceived as extremely vulnerable. We've all sort of heard rumors about polling where her approval rating is very, very low. And in fact, in announcing that he wasn't going to run, Mike Quigley made sure to make it clear that he thought that if he had, he was going to beat her, which is quite a choice to make when there is at least another year of the Lightfoot administration that he, as the North Side's congressperson, is going to have to work with her doing. But, the sense is that maybe Lightfoot was feeling so vulnerable that she wouldn't run for a second term. So it's clear that by these sort of repeated yep, I'm working on it, yep, it's coming, she's trying to allay those fears. I think we all also have a little bit of, just remembering what happened all the way back in 2018 when everybody thought Rahm Emanuel was certain to run. And then all of a sudden, nearly out of nowhere with petitions on the street, came out at City Hall and said, I'm not running again. So I think both things are happening there. But, you really can't discount the power of an incumbent mayor to run for re-election. But it's clear it's not going to be a cakewalk.
Certainly a lot of time to decide here, although the sooner she decides, probably the more fundraising she can do. There have been some political consultants out there saying, well, the person that's going to ultimately be the top challenger to Lightfoot hasn't entered the race yet. Jacqueline Serrato, any names come to mind of folks that have not jumped in yet that might down the road?
No, in the Latinx community in particular, there's always conversation about who may run for mayor, and it used to be Chuy Garcia, but obviously that's not really an option anymore now that he's in Congress. So, I think people are still having conversations, but there aren't any names that really come to mind.
And the Chuy Garcia rumors, I've heard them this cycle around, too. I haven't talked to the congressman himself, but, lots of names get thrown out there. All right, let's talk about some of the big action in City Council this week. The full council passes the mayor's gas card giveaway, but not without road bumps from a number of aldermen who said the money had been could have been put to better use. Here's a little bit of that debate.
And when we're giving $3 million to the food depository and $12 million for gas cards, something is a little off.
In this city, there are people who barely have a couple dollars in their pocket. Yes, of course, we're trying to move towards lowering our carbon footprint. We have an obligation to do that as a city. But meanwhile, back on planet reality, a lot of folks have to drive.
Mike Mulligan, if you're a voter and you get a nice new $50 gas card in the mail, does it mean you're going to go out and re-elect the politician that made that happen?
Yeah, I don't think $50 is enough, frankly, if you filled up your car recently. It is, I was telling my wife the other day after, I didn't even know how much it was. It was crazy. There was a time in my life where I couldn't go to work if gas was this expensive. Now, obviously, times have changed for me, but I got to tell you, I don't know how people get through it. And I think that those, the CTA passes, we've got to do whatever we can do to help people get through this. Gas is crazy, and by all accounts, it's going even higher. I think people are trying to do whatever they can do, and I don't think you're buying votes by doing this. I think it really is important for the city not to be at a standstill.
Jackie Serrato, how helpful can this be, especially in communities on the south and west side?
I think people are really do appreciate it. I think Mayor Lori Lightfoot took a page from Willie Wilson's generosity, right? Even though those giveaways were pretty chaotic, people were very, very grateful. They were willing to stand in line for hours to get up early just to get some free gas. So I know that people are excited that, these gas cards and Venture cards are available and that they actually have a chance at being eligible for one of them because there's going to be monthly lotteries. So, yeah, I think people are excited.
Becky Vivi, remind us how this is going to work. It's a $12 million plus program here. Who's going to be eligible and how are they going to be able to get the card?
Yeah, so it's only if you make 100% of the area median income or less. So for a single person, I don't have the exact figures. For a single person, 60-some thousand, and for a family of 4, 90-some thousand. And I think there's an application online that you can go and fill out, and they're going to do a lottery every month, like Jackie said, and give away, I believe it is 100,000 of the $50 transit cards and 50,000 of the $150 gas cards. So there's a lot there. A lot of people will get them. I think whether the question of if I'm going to get a gas card, am I going to vote for a candidate? Who knows how people are going to vote, but they're certainly going to not vote just because somebody gave them a gas card. So it's sort of one of these kind of it can't hurt sorts of programs. And, it's definitely something that, who doesn't like to win something?
Well, and who doesn't like to put their name on something that puts cash in the pockets of voters? Heather Sharon, the little kerfluffle about having Mayor Lori Lightfoot's name on that card. Is her name staying on that card?
It will be on that card. And I think it's really interesting that in the past, 2 years, the whole sort of debate over giving people cash assistance directly from the government has changed just 180 degrees. This is the legacy really of Andrew Yang in the Democratic primary in 2020, where he talked about the need for a universal basic income. And, I think it bears mentioning as we talk about the gas cards and the CTA passes that the city's test of a universal basic income, the applications are open now. And in the first 24 hours, 90,000 Chicagoans applied for that. So it's $500 a month for a year. So that that could change people's lives, honestly. And I think that gives you a sense of just sort of how much need and how much really economic despair is out there. And it will be very interesting to see how that lottery works out, because only 5,000 families will get that help. And whether that proves to be a political boon for Mayor Lightfoot or whether it hurts her when people start getting those rejections, and they start feeling angry about it.
And this is supposed to be kind of a pilot run here to see if it would work perhaps on a larger citywide scale. I want to talk about a disturbing report that came out this week that shows that life expectancy dropping over the last year for communities of color in Chicago since the beginning of the pandemic. Jackie Serrato, is this all about COVID-19 or is this about other factors, especially in black and brown communities?
Well, I think black and brown communities really bore the brunt of COVID deaths. I mean, if we're looking at specific neighborhoods, Austin, Little Village, South Shore were the hardest hit by COVID. Like each one of these neighborhoods had anywhere from like 200 to over 300 deaths. So of course, that's going to skew the average lifespan in each one of these communities. I mean, not to mention that in general, there's a lack of affordable health care in many of these neighborhoods. There is a desert of hospitals and local clinics. So, you know, I think these are systematic issues that simply manifested themselves, especially during COVID.
And I want to talk about another issue, obviously, that affects lifespan, and that's crime. We saw the highest number of shootings of the year last weekend when the weather was warm. We saw groups of folks causing trouble on Michigan Avenue, crime on the CTA. We saw even yesterday a video out of a freshman high school baseball game where shots apparently rang out right across the street. To Mike Mulligan, are we just in for another violent summer in Chicago like last year?
It sure looks that way. And I got to tell you, it is really depressing that we are finally kind of out of being in lockdown, and the response is that we're having this kind of crime issue. It is, you know, there's no solution in sight, apparently. I mean, there's nobody coming up with any way of deterring this. It's just, it is, you know, having been downtown working off Michigan Avenue, it's like it's every weekend. You know, we go down and park in the garage sometimes, and goodness gracious, it's scary.
And it certainly doesn't seem like the foot traffic has returned to the Loop or the normal hustle and bustle that you see. Becky Vivi, does this mean trouble for the tenure of Police Superintendent David Brown, or is his fortune too closely tied to Mayor Lightfoot's fortune?
I think his fortune's definitely tied to her fortune. And I can't see her replacing him prior to election. If, you know, there's been a lot of strife and internal pressure already to, you know, there are a lot of people I don't think within the rank and file who like him very much. And I think that, you know, she's so far rebuffed many of the critics and kept him in place. She has a lot of confidence in him. And so we'll see, but I can't see her doing an overhaul prior to election. You know, they talk a lot about their numbers and the way that they kind of slice things. And I know that they've touted the homicide clearance rate reducing, but, you know, I can't see her. I think their fates are very tied together.
I want to talk about another crime issue, Heather Sharon. We saw that the ward superintendent of embattled 45th Ward Alderman James Gardner was arrested for allegedly trying to sell a machine gun that he says was an antique that his grandfather had used in World War II. First of all, how does this impact Gardner himself? Because we and others have reported he is under federal investigation, that is.
Well, that's right. And what's interesting is that a ward superintendent is somebody who is hired directly by the city council person. So Charles Sakanich, who is facing these charges, was Alderman Jim Garner's choice to really respond to the quality of life issues in the 45th Ward, which includes Jefferson Park and parts of Portage Park. And I think that it, you know, bears questioning whether he picked the right person for this job, given these charges. And of course, as you and I have reported, Paris, it's not the first time there have been allegations against Gardner and Sakanich. The two are accused of harassing a man who found Sakanich's cell phone. There's a federal sort of lawsuit over that. There's also allegations that Jim Gardner improperly blocked people from his social media page because he didn't like their opinions. And of course, Jim Gardner sent these really eye-popping text messages about City Hall staffers and a homophobic comment about Alderman Tom Tunney. So, you know, he's only been in office for 3 years, but it has been quite a tenure. And neither you nor I have been able to get him on the phone or in front of a camera to ask him to respond to these questions. Elections coming up, and we'll have to see how that all plays out.
And a lot of times these stories break with respect to him. We go over to his office and the blinds are drawn there, so no one can really look in. Jackie Serrato, I want to talk about this kind of surprise news today that Amazon/Whole Foods will close its Whole Foods store in Englewood. I remember when Mayor Rahm Emanuel touted this as sort of a really big boon to the community. It had been a food desert. Why do you think Whole Foods is going to pull out now?
Yeah, this was the news of the day in the South Side today, and people have different reactions, and that's because not everybody shops there. I think people also weren't fully surprised because they understood that this chain store had a great incentive to move into this area, right, in the form of millions of dollars in tax breaks. But also, I think there was this question of like, how invested were they actually in the community and being involved with the community? And I think we know that the prices at Whole Foods are typically above other grocers in the South Side, like Jewel's, Aldi, Food for Less, right? And with many people hurting financially in the city, I think it's likely that Whole Foods was simply not reaching enough Englewood consumers. I think that Whole Foods as well, and I'm sorry to say this, in Black and Brown communities can be a symbol of gentrification. And this particular store was opened with the hope of spurring development, but development for whom, right? Like, was their selection and their prices tailored to a local community? I think these are some of the questions that are up in the air.
And those are, I remember the store officials were promising that they were going to tailor the prices and the selections to the community. The mayor came out today and said she's disappointed. Jackie, do you think that she should try and do more to keep them there, or try to find another tenant there?
Well, I think that this will, I hope that this will encourage us to just reevaluate whether subsidizing corporations, right, and expecting them to reverse decades of disinvestment is the best way to encourage community growth and address food deserts. I think this is a model that didn't work. But having said that, I know that people are working locally to offer other alternatives, like on 63rd and Racine, pretty close by. There's a new store called Go Green Community Fresh Market, and this was a result of nonprofits coming together and working together.
Right. We had our own Nick Blumberg out there last night talking about that. Heather Sharon, I want to also talk about this standoff between one of the owners of the Chicago Reader and the staff of the Chicago Reader. It was kind of like a game of chicken where the owner, Len Goodman, blinked. He stepped down, and now the Reader's going to transition to non-for-profit. How is that going to impact the paper going forward?
Well, I think it really gives it a new lease on life. And I rarely express an opinion on shows like this, but I will say that a healthy, strong reader is good for all of Chicago. It is good for WTTW. It is good for WBEZ. It is good for Southwest Side Weekly. It is probably even good for The Score.
More journalism is always better.
Right. So I think a lot of people are breathing a sigh of relief that, our colleagues at the Reader are now going to be paid, because that was certainly a question, and that the Reader is going to continue its 50-year history of really sort of digging into the crevices, not just in politics, but arts and culture and music. And I know I personally am very relieved for my friends over there.
All right, let's get into some statewide politics. Becky Vivi, Secretary of State candidate. Ana Valencia, she's been under a lot of fire. She, of course, is the current city clerk in Chicago. Under fire because her husband is a lobbyist who has lobbied the city, and there's a lot of questions about whether she's been involved in some of that lobbying. This week, she came out in a news interview saying she should have maybe been more careful in setting up that sort of dividing line. Does that answer some of the questions that have been out there?
I mean, it does, but I think there are still a lot left unanswered. And I know that Marianne Ahern at NBC5 has really been digging on this, and I know she's gotten even more documents showing this was kind of a habit of Valencia's. It wasn't just a slip up with a few emails and a few text messages, that there were a lot of blurry lines between her and her husband. And, it's her husband. Of course, you have a lot of communication with your partner, but when you're working in government and he's a lobbyist, there are certainly guardrails that need to be put in place. And as she's seeking higher office, the Secretary of State is a very competitive race right now. I think this is a fair interesting sort of thing that we're seeing play out.
Two of the candidates, Janulius and Valencia, have that kind of baggage. There's also David Moore, the alderman, who's running, but Janulius, of course, has the issue with his family bank that went under. Heather Sharon, does this kind of these kind of Oppo stories impact voters?
So, that's a really good question, because the June primaries, it's a while away yet, right? So the question I often ask myself is, am I the only one paying attention to these stories? But I think Becky's right. I think if you're running for a position like Secretary of State, which is going to have a huge amount of employees that you're going to hire, big power over just massive bureaucracies in the state of Illinois, you have to be prepared to answer questions about how you handled your role at Chicago City Hall. And it's hard to overstate how central the City Key program, which is what sort of is at the heart of these allegations, has been to Anna Valencia's term as city clerk. And I think there's probably more we're going to learn about there, because her tone this week was very different than it was several weeks ago when she was first confronted with this reporting. She said, I'd done nothing wrong, and if there was a typo on an ethics form, we'll correct it. That was not what she's saying this week. And I think that's only going to raise more questions.
And it might mean that they're seeing some internal polling that says those stories are making some kind of an impact. All right, we're going to move over to sports now and put Mike Mulligan on the clock. First of all, Mike, do we know who the Bears, they had 2 picks in the second round. They did the first pick. Have they made the second pick yet?
The pick is in. I don't have it announced. I'm refreshing, but the
all right,
pick
I'm getting told it's someone named Jaquan Brisker from Penn State.
Yes, he's the safety, I believe, right?
Yeah. Okay, so the Bears needed to give Justin Fields protection and weapons, and they drafted 2 defensive backfield players.
I can't say I'm thrilled about that, frankly. We'll see what they do as you move forward in the draft, but the general manager came in and he's made a big point about talking about the offensive line, and they had one guy they tried to sign that he was matched, and they failed to get him, Ryan Bates. So they're short a player. They've let James Daniels go. They need a right guard, and they need tackles, quite frankly. I think you could argue they needed 2 offensive linemen. And, it's interesting. They got a defensive-minded coach. They brought in 2 members of the secondary. They need starters at both those positions. They need starters at a lot of positions. So,
and they need weapons for Justin Fields.
It would be nice. And the good thing about this draft is there are more speed wide receivers that go on through the draft. You'll be able to fill those needs at every level. And, of course, their best receiver is Darnell Mooney, who was a former 5th-round pick.
Right.
So we'll have to wait and determine that. But usually, if you want to get a left tackle out of a draft, you need to do that in the first round, and they didn't have a first-round pick. And so this is just a position they're going to need. Maybe they have a plan. There's a couple of guys on the free agent market that they could throw some money at and see if they can line it up. The Bears have 6 picks in this draft. We're hoping they add more. Right. They only have 60-something guys signed, and you need 90 to go to camp.
Wow.
So they're only short about 30 players, but don't panic.
All right, Mike, get your pads and suit up and go try out. Let's talk about the Bulls. Zach LaVine, big star. He's a free agent now. Bulls fans want to know, is the team going to keep him around next year?
Yeah, I believe they will. I think that, they have to give him a max contract to do that, but they can pay him more money than any other team. And I think that Zach has probably earned a max deal. I don't know that he's a max player, if that makes any sense. I don't know that he is the number 1 player, let's say, on an NBA champion. But he is a 2-time All-Star. He is a guy that played through injury. Not everyone can say that. And he's got to get his knee cleaned up a little here in the offseason. And I would suspect they're going to give him a max contract to keep him back.
And the Bulls certainly excited people in the first half of the season. Then they fell off, and the series with Milwaukee exposed a lot of weaknesses on this team. So what does the front office have to do in the offseason to take that next step to go deep into the playoffs?
Yeah, the buzzword was continuity, but I think they know that they got to get better. And when you really look at their team, I mean, they failed. They won a game against Milwaukee in the playoffs, so God bless them. But that's the only game that they won against the top 3 teams in the East or the West this year. They just don't match up to the best team. So there has to be another step. And the question is how you do that. And we were talking about it today, just the idea being, if someone came to you with a trade offer, there is no one that's untouchable. You know, normally when you're talking about a winning team, you think that you have one guy you're building the team around. But, you know, as great as DeMar DeRozan was this year, he's 32 years old. You know, he's on the wrong side of 30. You've got to be aware that if you can make a move, you pretty much have to make it.
No one's off limits. And then you've got the young forward, Pat Williams. We'll see if he takes another step forward. But we are out of time for now. So our thanks to Mike Mulligan, Heather Sharon, Becky Vivi, and Jacqueline Serrato. Thank you so much. And that is our show for this Friday night. Don't forget you can get Chicago Tonight and the Week in Review streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. And be sure to join us Saturday for more on the life expectancy gap on Chicago Tonight Voices. That begins 6 p.m. tomorrow. And then we're back at 7 o'clock all next week. And now for the Week in Review, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great weekend.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights